There we go. Okay. Oops.
Then I press stop recording at the end.
No, you don't have to. You can just end the Zoom for everyone
Okay.
and it will automatically record. I mean, it'll automatically stop recording.
Okay. What are you reading, Maddie?
I just finished the new Mieko Kawakami.
Did you like it? You love her.
Yeah, I loved it.
What's it called? What's it called?
All the Lovers in the Night.
I don't know her work.
She's
Breasts
really
and Eggs.
What?
Have you heard of that, Eileen?
What's it called?
She wrote this book called Breast and Eggs.
Oh, she's the one. No, I haven't read
Yeah.
it.
And another book was translated into English, but I think she's been very popular in Japan for a while.
Yeah, exactly.
Hopefully we'll have more than 2 people, Eileen.
Who are the 2 people? You 2?
There seems to be 5 participants, so 3 of us and 2 more.
Oh, right.
I think more people will sign in.
Yeah, usually people come, like, don't even know they can come early,
Yeah,
like come on the dot or
Okay.
even a few minutes after.
I know at least 3 people.
we'll have at least. We'll have a few. Let me turn off my phone.
Now that you're the host, Cheryl, I actually realize you are going to have to admit all when in a few minutes when you're ready.
Okay.
I've given up
And
all
I
my
do that
capabilities.
with, I just view, and then I say admit all.
Yeah, you see
Okay.
the button. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Uh,
And then I mute all, hopefully.
people will come in with automatically muted. So you
Okay.
don't need to, but if somebody unmutes themselves at any point and there's like a noise, you can, you have the capability to do that. But
Okay.
it's only if somebody accidentally turns theirs off and then it's distracting.
Are you letting people in now?
It's 6:59. Should I admit them all?
It's
Yeah.
up to
Wait a
you.
few
You can
minutes.
wait a minute if you prefer and admit them.
You can
Okay.
hear me okay, right?
Oh yeah, you're very clear. Eileen, you did your last launch with us, right?
Mm-hmm.
At the Prince Street store. Okay, I'll mention that. I just wanted to make sure I remembered that correctly.
So you're going to introduce us, so Eileen doesn't have to introduce me. So there you go, Eileen.
Oh, I don't, okay. I did. do it.
You can if you want to. I mean, if you think it would be charming.
Weird.
Yeah, why don't you introduce me and then Maddie will introduce you. You want to do that?
No. Maddie will introduce you and you'll introduce me. right?
Okay,
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
cool. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to introduce Cheryl.
Yes.
Okay, so I'm gonna admit all.
Yeah.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Welcome to McNally Jackson Virtual Events. My name is Maddie, and I am our marketing director here. And we are so happy to be able to continue these virtual events in uncertain times, which really helps bring our audience together over books that we love and feel great about. And tonight is no exception. But tonight we have a conversation between two McNally Jackson alums, Cheryl, who is a bookseller with us, and Eileen, who has done her launches with us before. So it's kind of like a family reunion. But I'm going to introduce Cheryl, who will then introduce Eileen to you all. I'll also before I do that, I'll take a moment to note that I'm going to drop a link to the book in the comments. And I highly encourage you to use that link to buy the book, because that's, part of why we do this and how we can keep doing it. And I'm also during the event, feel free to use that same chat to ask Eileen questions for the end, which we'll be fielding. And about 20 minutes before 8, Cheryl will take a look at those questions and relay them. So she'll also give you a little bit of a reminder if you forget, but just think about your questions, drop them in the chat, and we'll get to them at the end. So Cheryl Pearl Suture, as I mentioned, is a bookseller at McNally Jackson, and her novel, The Rescue of Memory, was published by Scribner in hardcover and by the Berkeley Signature Series as a mass market paperback. Her awards include an NEA Fellowship in Fiction, a Kenyon Review Award for Literary Excellence, and a runner-up prize in the Mademoiselle Fiction Contest. For the past 20 years, she has lived between New York and New Zealand, where she was a host on the TV Hawke's Bay talk show Chat Room, and where she is currently a contributing feature writer and book reviewer for the New Zealand Listener. She is also a McNally Jackson OG who is endlessly revising her second novel, Alive Among the Ruins. So thank you, Cheryl. I will let you take it away. And thank you, Eileen. And we're so thrilled to have you back.
Thanks, Matt.
Hi, everybody. And I am going to introduce my dear friend. Let's see. How do we do this? Oh, God, we have to go back. I don't know. Oh, there I am. I am. Okay, I'm hosting this for the first time. They're giving it to me, which is maybe not such a good idea, but I'm going to do my best. So everybody have a little bit of patience with me. Eileen is my really good friend, and we became friendly basically when I asked her to be part of my interview series at McNally Jackson about her book, The Bible of Dirty Jokes. And I realized that we're two sides of the same coin, even though we didn't really know each other at the Iowa Writers Workshop. And I will introduce her. Eileen graduated from Yale with a BS in physics, the second woman to do so, right? And she earned an MFA a year after me from the Iowa Writers Workshop. And she's the author of the novels The Professor of Immortality, The Bible of Dirty Jokes, A Perfect Life, and Breaking and Entering, which was named New York Times Editor's Choice Selection, as well as 2 collections of short fiction, The Rabbi in the Attic and In the Mouth, which won the Edward Lewis Walland Award. I went to Wesleyan with Kim Walland, his daughter. He died very young, Edward Walland, anyway. Eileen's work of creative nonfiction, Women Walking Ahead in Search of Catherine Weldon and Sitting Bull, was made into a movie starring Jessica Chastain. And her investigative memoir, The Only Woman in the Room, Why Science is Still a Boys' Club, was published in 2015. And a long excerpt appeared in the New York Times Sunday magazine and went viral. Her work has been selected for the Best American Short Stories, Best American Essays, and Best American Travel Writing. And she formerly is the director of the MFA program at the University of Michigan, where some of her students are some of our most storied contemporary writers. And she now lives and writes in Boston, even though she made a pit stop in New York for a few years, which is where we cemented our friendship. I'm going to begin by saying that today is International Holocaust Remembrance Day. This was not on purpose, I don't think, by Delphinium, Eileen Pollack's publisher, or by us, but it's a significant day for me. And I know as an interviewer, I shouldn't talk about myself, but I think it's a good segue into what it means to publish fiction in our times. I wrote my book, I think when Dwight D. Eisenhower was president, and it came out in August. And I was fortunate enough to have a short documentary made about me and my family for Good Morning America. But because there was a big political event The documentary didn't make it to television until January. And by that time, the books were no longer in the stores. So even though my mother, who was alive, got to see me, there is a notion where it's really good to buy a book when it comes out. It's great for the author. It's great for the publisher. It's great for everyone who loves books. And so that's my little aphorism for today. And from that, I'm going to ask Eileen to talk a little bit about Maybe It's Me and to read a little from the first essay, Pigeons.
Thanks so much, Cheryl. And I should say that, so Cheryl's the child of Holocaust survivors, and her first novel, The Rescue of Memory, was one of the first major works of fiction to really deal with being an American child of survivors and all that entailed. It's a wonderful book. And what really cemented our friendship was we took a road trip. The Iowa Writers Workshop was having a reunion, of celebrating some anniversary. And it's the kind of place where when you go back to your reunion, you need moral support. So we agreed to meet in Chicago and drive out to Iowa together. And we knew we were going to be very close. We were in the car rental agency, and Cheryl said, "Look, there's Stormy Daniels." And we sort of, that was a big event for both of us to see Stormy Daniels. So it was sort of a Thelma and Louise trip. This collection, Maybe It's Me, on Being the Wrong Kind of Woman, is just a collection of essays I've been working on since the late 90s. But I want to say it goes back to when I was 11 years old. I like to think I invented the memoir form. I had this bright idea. I thought, I'm going to write about what it's like to be me. And what it's like to be an 11-year-old girl. And I remember telling this to my older sister, and she said, "Who would want to read that?" And I thought, well, I don't know, maybe she's right. I guess who would want to read it? But I was such an egotist. I thought this was a great idea. And then when I was in 7th grade, we had this very strange English teacher for 1 year before she got fired, Miss Stark. And what she did for me, I'll never forget, we were at the Scholastic Book Fair. Those of you remember the Scholastic Book Fair. And she picked up this book, The Second Tree from the Corner, and she gave it to me, a 7th grader. It was a collection of essays by E.B. White, and said, "Here, you should read this." And you're in 7th grade, you don't even really know what a short story is, what an essay is, but I read some of the lines. I remember it was something that was so hot that the postage stamps were mating in the drawer. And I thought, what is that? Whatever this is, I want to do it. Kind of put that thought aside. I majored in science for various reasons. I loved physics, but I took a class in nonfiction writing. I couldn't get into any of the fiction writing classes at Yale. You had to be much higher on the food chain than I was, with John Hersey, who really taught me a lot about what it meant to write creative nonfiction. So over the years, and then when I was at Michigan and I was teaching composition, essay writing, I thought that most ways of teaching essay writing were very boring. And so I was calling on what Hersey had taught me, what I knew from E.B. White, various people. So I started writing these essays about my life. And when it came time to come up with a title, well, I should say that the last essay I wrote when I was living in New York was about dating in your 60s, online dating mostly in New York City, and how horrifying that was. And the question you keep asking over and over is it me? Maybe it's me. Why am I having all these terrible experiences? And so I with the help of a friend, realized that was really the connecting theme of all the essays in the book. Anyway, Cheryl, this is the first event I'm doing for the book, so I'm still figuring out how to, what I want to say, instead of getting the spiel, you're getting incoherence. So the first essay, Pigeons, is about being in 3rd grade, being the wrong kind of girl. I was making a lot of trouble because I was bored out of my mind. The teacher hated me. And as punishment for my misbehaving, she would keep me from working in the workbooks that actually interested me. So I behaved even more badly. So she finally sent me to the school psychologist. I had no idea why, but he was a very strange man. His name was Mr. Spyro. So Cheryl suggested I read this excerpt from my terrible meeting with the school psychologist, Mr. Spyro. Mr. Spyro settled behind his desk and motioned me to sit in the chair beside it. Bushy black curls exploded from his head like the lines a cartoonist draws to indicate a character is confused or drunk. Mr. Spyro, I remember thinking, which is how, 4 decades later, I could still recall his name. His heavy brows, gigantic nose, and thickly thatched mustache seemed connected to his glasses, like those disguises you could buy at Woolworth's. His suit was white with thin red stripes, like the boxes movie popcorn came in, and he wore a bright red bow tie. This was 1964. I had never seen a man in a shirt that wasn't white, or a suit that wasn't dark, or a tie that called attention to itself. And I felt the thrill and dread any child would feel at being selected from the audience by a clown. He must have sensed I distrusted him. "Would you like some Oreos?" he asked, then slid a packet across the desk. I can still see those cookies, so chocolatey rich and round, the red thread around their cellophane cocoon just waiting to be unzipped. But a voice in my head warned me to be careful. It was as if the clown had motioned me to sniff the bright pink carnation fastened to his lapel. "How do I know these cookies aren't poisoned?" I asked. The bushy black eyebrows shot up. "Do you really think I would poison you?" he said. "Well," I said, "you're a stranger. How do I know you wouldn't?" I don't remember what happened next. He probably reassured me the Oreos were fit to eat. I don't remember if I ate them. All I know is he changed the subject. In a falsely jolly tone, he said, "So, I hear you want to be an authoress." If he had asked if I wanted to be an author, I would have told him yes. But I had never heard that word, authoress, and it seemed dangerous as a snake. "Authoress," it hissed, like otherness or adulteress, a word I had encountered in a novel and didn't quite understand, except to know I didn't want to be one. "Who told you that?" I demanded. "Why, your teacher, Mrs. Neff." "That's because she doesn't like me," I said. "She probably told you a lot of other lies too, but those aren't true either." He began scribbling on a pad, and even a child of 8 knows anything a school psychologist writes about you on a pad can't be any good. Outside on the ledge, a pair of plump gray pigeons bobbled back and forth like seedy vaudeville comics. This was the Catskills after all. Pigeon variations of Don Rickles and Buddy Hackett, who sidestepped toward each other, traded a dirty joke, then bumped shoulders in raunchy glee and shuckled back across the stage. "Well then," he finished writing, "I hear you're a very bright little girl, and I would like you to take some tests that are designed to show if you're smart enough to skip a grade." Tests, I thought. What kind of tests? Who suggested I skip a grade? Then it came to me, Mrs. Neff. If she couldn't get rid of me any other way, she would skip me a year ahead. I would miss Harry and Eric, the boys I couldn't resist jabbing in the spine as we walked down the hall, but 4th grade had to be less boring than 3rd. Bring on the tests, I thought, expecting a mimeograph sheet of addition and subtraction problems or some paragraphs to read aloud. Mr. Spyro brought out a flip book. He showed me drawing after drawing, asking me to describe what was missing from each. But how could a person know what was missing from a picture if there was nothing to compare it to? Did every house have a chimney? Was the daisy missing a petal, or had someone merely plucked it? After we finished with the flip book, Mr. Spyro brought out a board fitted with colored shapes. He would flash a pattern on a card and ask me to reproduce it. As I recall, he timed me. But as vivid as my memory is for people and events, I have a terrible time remembering patterns and facts. Had the purple triangle been positioned above or below the line? Had the rectangle been blue or green? And who decreed that playing with colored shapes should determine if a child was ready to skip a grade? It wasn't enough to be smart. You needed to be smart in the ways grown-ups wanted you to be smart. Finally, Mr. Spyro presented me with a test like the ones I was used to taking. If you want to buy 3 pencils, he said, and 1 pencil costs 4 cents, how much would it cost to buy all 3? I was about to add 3 and 4 when I realized this required a different kind of math. I could have figured out the answer by adding 4 3 times, but something about being so bored that I had misbehaved, which had denied me the chance to work in my math workbook, which had denied me the chance to learn to multiply, which seemed to be preventing me from going on to 4th grade where I might be less bored and less tempted to misbehave, made me cry out, "This isn't fair." But when Mr. Spyro asked me what wasn't fair, I couldn't put my grievance into words. We sat in silent stalemate until a pigeon flew in the room. It flapped around our heads and beat its wings against the walls, but this struck me as no stranger than anything else that had happened in that room. For all I knew, Mr. Spyro had trained the pigeon to fly in on cue and test some aspect of my psychology I would need to pass 4th grade. The safest response, I decided, was no response at all. Mr. Spyro, on the other hand, leapt up on his desk and started waving his arms and shouting. Imagine sitting in a chair looking up at a full-grown man in a red and white striped suit who was standing on his desk flailing at a pigeon. I might have understood if he had been flailing at a bee, but what harm could a pigeon do? At last, the pigeon found a crevice at the very top of the belfry and disappeared inside. My final glimpse of its bobbing rear end is the image I still see whenever I hear the word pigeonhole. Mr. Spyro smoothed his suit, climbed down from his desk, and asked why I hadn't been more upset. Hadn't I noticed a pigeon was in the room? All these years later, I still remember what I said. Why should I be upset? This isn't my office. I'm not the one who has to clean up after it. Then I remember nothing more until a disheveled Mr. Spyro led me back to class. Later, he told my mother I wasn't emotionally ready to skip a grade. The experience left me more resentful than ever. I misbehaved more and more. The following year, my teacher grew so impatient with my incessant chattering that in front of everyone, she said, "Eileen, has anyone ever told you how obnoxious you are?" Obnoxious, I repeated, delighted and appalled by the toxicity of the word. Obnoxious, was I? Fine. I shunned the company of the other girls and hung around with the roughest boys who were even more obnoxious than I was. I still did well on tests. What was I supposed to do? Pretend I didn't know how to add or multiply? But I refused to act the part of the well-mannered little lady the grown-ups wanted me to play. I looked for Mr. Spyro, but I never saw the man again. I searched in vain for his secret office. From outside on the playground, I could look up and see the belfry, but the windows were boarded up, and the pigeons, like me, couldn't find a way to get inside.
Thank you. I like that essay because I think it introduces the themes of the book. Is that it really introduces who you are, because you were definitely who you are at the age of 9. Suspicious, smarter than the adults, a little bit sassy, trying to fit in but not able to fit in. And there's the metaphor of the pigeon, something that flies in, that disturbs some people, that doesn't disturb others. Was that a memory that you kept for a long time, or was it something that came back to you when you were writing something else?
That memory I kept. What happened is when I went back to the school to do the research for my book about why there aren't more women in science, I figured out that Mr. Spyro's office had been the site of something much worse, which was in 6th grade, and this is where the essay goes next. I had a terrible teacher in 6th grade, awful man. And he would have much rather been a photographer than a teacher. And he just spent all his time telling us about this expensive camera he wanted to buy. And what had been Mr. Spyro's office adjoined our classroom, which was down this eerie passageway. In these old schools, there were all these strange passageways and rooms you couldn't find again. I go there in my nightmares all the time. Anyway, he had turned it into a dark room. And there was a boy I really liked in that grade. And even as, I was so concerned with how miserable my life was being made, this boy was being treated much worse. And the teacher really had it in for him. And because of something the teacher thought that this boy did to me, he took him in that room and beat the crap out of him. And so the rest of the essay actually follows what happened to that boy. And one thing I'm trying to explore in some of these essays and in the novel I'm working on now is not so much my own traumas, but how bad I felt, how that blinded me to what everybody else was going through. That, you know, there were a couple of kids who had it great, you know, in elementary school and junior high and high school. And I think everybody else was miserable, but each in their own way, and some much worse than others. And there were, you know, kids who were just suffering so much worse than I was. But, you know, I think what I was going through kind of blinded me to everybody else's sorrows. And as I say at the end of that essay, you know, I did fine. I came out fine. But the other little boy ended up dead, as did many of my classmates. It was astonishing out of such a small class how many kids didn't even make it through high school, let alone much past that. So yeah, I remembered my little trauma, but when I went back, what clicked for me was what I hadn't, all the suffering I hadn't seen around me at the time.
One of the things that's very thematic in the book, and we're about the same age, I always felt like we were between everything. You know, I mean, we both had older siblings, and they had the anti-war movement and the free love movement. And I remember when I was in college, we were looking for South African divestiture. And that your parents were not survivors, but your grandparents, your great-grandparents came to the family. You grew up in the Catskills, which doesn't exist anymore. You know, it's sort of like my family comes from a world that doesn't exist anymore, and trying to really keep that thing alive. And through all the suffering, there's a tremendous amount of humor. I mean, that's one of the ways that we bonded. There's this, one of the essays, Hallucinations, is this beautiful memory of you sitting at your father's bedside when he's in hospice, and he's not getting enough oxygen to his brain. And he was a dentist in his life. And he was just moving his hands, doing the gestures he had done his whole life without knowing that he, you know, he was hallucinating. And while you were sitting at his bedside, you were channeling his sense of humor into the Bible of dirty jokes. So the essay is very novelistic in that it goes one step, two, three, four steps beyond observation into some other revelation. And I find that's very novelistic because it goes farther than just a single journey. I want you to read from another one, which is The Jewish Shah, just the introduction, because I find that absolutely fascinating. And it's a story that became a research project, and I think all of us will go home and try to see if there's any truth in it. But it's also about your father. You know,
Right.
it's a way of sort of memorializing without concretizing someone's life. It was really like carrying on a tradition and making it into something new as well.
Well, you know, so it's really interesting because my dad, you know, was a child of immigrants, grew up partly on the Lower East Side in Brooklyn, but mostly in the Catskills. His father, pretty much against the wishes of his mother, started a hotel in the Catskills. So he grew up at this Borscht Belt Hotel, which is where the humor came from. And he just memorized every routine, every joke, you know, all these comics came through our hotel, even though we were a small place. Buddy Hackett got his start at our hotel. So he was just this font of jokes, right? And it wasn't observational humor, it was jokes, but he also could tell a good story, good funny story. And so if you grew up in the Catskills, humor really was the only culture, and it was the ethos. It was no matter how bad things were, you know, your hotel was empty, burning down, a guest had just died in the kitchen, in the dining room, you know, you had to tell it in a funny way, you know, to keep from crying, as people say. But, you know, and a lot of the guests were survivors, immigrants. They had been through horror shows, but the currency was usually the dirty joke, or at least a joke. And so in some ways it took over my father's whole being. He, you know, by the end, he was a dentist, you know, so he's hallucinating that he's working on his patients, but he's also just this almost a tape of all the jokes, and he's just doing these routines. And so sometimes it was hard to get through to the actual person under the dental technique and the jokes, but I felt like he and I really sometimes did, we shared a sensibility. And if anybody besides my mother knew about his life, it was me. So this one was his, I grew up hearing this legend that he would tell us, which he fully believed, which I have to say I also believe, that the Shah of Iran was Jewish. And I had a year at Michigan where they let me be a fellow at an institute, a research institute, and I got a research assistant. I didn't know what to do with her. And I finally said, you know, just go to the library and see if you, whatever you can find about the Shah of Iran and his ancestry. So all good essays come from a question. And mine was, could my father's cockamamie story possibly have been true? So I'll just read the first page and a half. It's called The Jewish Shah. The Shah of Iran is Jewish, my father would remind us whenever the newspaper ran a story about Iran, which was often in those days, the 60s and early 70s. One issue of Life magazine showed a magnificent red silk tent supporting a chandelier over a resplendent array of emperors and ambassadors dining in the desert at the Shah's celebration of 2,500 years of Persian history and 30 years of its own Pahlavi regime. My father knew the Shah was Jewish because he had been told the secret by his best friend from dental school, with whom he also served in World War II. Just don't tell anyone, my father warned. If the Shah knew we knew his secret, he would send his police to bump us off, which I also have to say my father truly believed. When I was writing this essay, he was still alive and he was terrified that the Savak, which no longer existed, would come all the way to America and kill me. I loved to hear his story. As far as I could tell, it was the only romantic part of my father's life. I had little respect for his profession or the role he had served in the war, fixing the teeth of British soldiers in Calcutta, India. His best friend, Sidney Paley, and I said, so Sidney's last name is Polivy, which is the Russian Jewish spelling, and Pahlavi, which is the name of the regime of the Shah of Iran, is spelled Pahlavi, but they sound the same, obviously. His best friend, Sidney Paley, another Jewish dentist from New York, used to joke that he and my father should slip over the border to Iran and visit the Shah, who happened to be his cousin. As Sidney told the tale, 4 of his uncle's sons had fled Russia in their teens to avoid conscription by the Tsar. The 5th cousin went east instead of west, making his way over the Caucasus Mountains to Persia. He tried to earn a living as a peddler, but eventually joined or was inducted into a troop of Cossacks. He hid his origins, became a Muslim, and rose quickly through the ranks. There was a coup. He changed his name and declared himself the Shah. At the start of World War II, he threw in with Hitler, and his brothers in America washed their hands of their black sheep relative. But seeing as how Sidney and my father were in the neighborhood, they might as well stop by to visit. My father and his friend never made it to Iran. Victory was declared and the men were sent home. My father opened a dental practice in the Catskills and Sidney in the Bronx. We drifted apart, my father said. We would correspond, but not as often. Sidney and his wife drove up to Liberty to see my parents. Then we had a falling out, my mother said. They never came back. She wasn't sure why. It bothered my father that he and his friend lost contact. We were like 2 brothers, he said, shaking his head. But what can you do? The years slipped by. My father was looking forward to seeing Sidney at their 30th dental school reunion. Your mother and I had just walked in when someone ran up to me and said, your friend Sidney just died. I nearly fainted. It hit me like a ton of bricks. Telling the story about the Shah must have been a way for my father to keep his friend's memory alive. Besides, he believed the story. I wanted to believe it too. And in the fall of 2000, when I had a year off from teaching and a grant to do some research, I decided to find out if it could be true. And as I said, I'm convinced it is true, but not everyone is.
It's an amazing essay. And, I have to tell you, by the end of it, I believed it.
Shh, we'll be bumped off.
One of the things I want to talk about is, it's International Holocaust Remembrance Day. We're both Jews, and our Jewishness and whether we're atheists or humanists, inflects our work to a great deal. And two of the most challenging and I think most successful essays in the collection have to do with you're having a long affair with the righteous Gentile, Marion, and you go to Poland with him. And the experience, I went to Poland also with someone who cared for my mother, who was a Polish Catholic. And that experience is so hard to describe, and yet you did it so beautifully. And then, of course, being somewhat comedic, you wind up in the best hospital in Krakow, and you almost have your uterus removed when you don't need it to have it removed. So it's kind of a metaphor for the entire experience. And then as a coda to that relationship, you were supposed to go with Marion to Israel. And your relationship broke up, but you decided you were going to go on your own, which is again very characteristic of the essays, that you go on, you carry on despite all challenges. And you go to the hardest places, you experience the good and the bad. And I felt that was very courageous because as a Jewish writer, if you talk about politics in any shape or form, you can be assaulted or attacked before anybody even reads you. But there was a great judiciousness and caring about that essay. And I wanted to know about the experience of writing both those essays.
Yeah, almost all these essays were really scary to write. And when I teach nonfiction writing, the students somehow think that it's very minor part of the experience of writing nonfiction to be scared of the reaction you're going to get. And I tell them, no, that's about 90% of what writing nonfiction is being scared of the reaction that you're going to get. As I said before, you want to write from a question. If you write about what you already know, you're not going to learn anything. Your readers are not going to experience any sense of discovery. And writing into what you don't know, what might be controversial, is really scary. So, writing anything about Israel, especially if you're on a college campus, just saying the word Israel can seem scary. You're going to get attacked from both sides. And as I say in the essay, I just, people who knee-jerk are against anything and everything that has to do with Israel, I got to kind of fight against that. And then I know people who are like, Israel is right no matter what. And if you say one word against it, you're terrible. And so writing anything about Israel is upsetting and is scary. And all I could do, but I wanted to find out what I really thought. And most people have never been there. I had never been there. And it is so much of the country is just, you can't have any idea of what's going on there from over here. Or if you go there in a, bubble, in a sheltered tour where you're only seeing and hearing what whoever's leading the tour wants you to see and hear. So that was very scary. It was scary just even to be driving around there, not knowing what I was doing. You end up driving into someplace you're not supposed to be. So a lot of that. But the biggest thing that happened to me there, and I was thinking about this, when Joan Didion, may she rest in peace, died, they were quoting her line that she was somewhere in the Hague in the 60s and saw a small child who was on a trip on acid. And she thought that was terrible for the child, but as a writer, she was thrilled because she knew that would make good writing. It was sort of the same thing in Israel. I wanted it to be great, but then terrible things happened. And you're like, I wish this weren't happening, but it's great. I have to write about this. What happened was I was trying to get to the Israel Museum, which is in the outskirts of Jerusalem. It was late in the day. I was exhausted. It was hot, and none of the taxis would stop for me. And then a taxi stopped, very nice man. And we were driving through some very narrow streets. And suddenly the taxi in front of us, and we got boxed in by these cars. And we're just sitting there. I didn't know what was going on. And then this mob of men and some women surrounded the car and started banging on the windows and shouting things at the driver who's just sitting there motionless. I didn't know what was going on, and nobody could tell me. And at one point, I rolled down my window a little way to ask somebody, and a man, a religious man with a long beard, Jewish man, reached in, opened my car door, opened the door, and pulled me out and started pulling me through the mob to his car. And I could not figure, I mean, obviously it was scary, but I mean, they were Jews. I didn't know, I mean, it wasn't, what were they going to do to me? But finally, one woman said in English, they didn't want me, our women in a car with their men. It was an Arab driver. And they were going to take me in their car. And when I realized what was going on and how horrifying and racist that was, I got away and I ran back to the taxi, got in, rolled up the window, locked the door, and said I wouldn't leave the guy. Anyway, we stayed there for a really long time till finally the mob gave up and left. And so, you know, when you're experiencing stuff like that, which obviously wouldn't happen if you were on a tour, you can't just go back and say, oh, everything here is wonderful. On the other hand, I was blown away by how much, you know, just feelings that I didn't think I would have, the beauty of the place, the history, being with just Jews. And, you know, one small thing was I was staying with some people I barely knew, and there were Israeli women's magazines in the bathroom. And I couldn't figure out why I thought the models were so unattractive. And then I realized it was because they looked like me, or I looked like them. They were, you know, had curly hair, and their noses were more like mine. Their shape was more like mine. They were short, you know, and I thought, who knew what I, you know, that I finally at that age realized I had been brought up to think nobody like me could possibly be a model in a women's magazine, you know, hence, you know, maybe it's me, the wrong kind of woman. So there were so many thoughts and feelings about going there. As I said, it's like being adopted and going to meet your biological mother, and, you know, what if you hate her, or what if you love her? You know, it changes everything about who you thought you were.
One of the things that I found remarkable about the essays is you don't censor yourself and you don't apologize for your reactions. And you do a lot of research. You know, it's sort of like when you come out with a declaration about the history, you've done your research, but that somehow doesn't cloud your impressions of your experience. You know, the emotion in most of these essays is very raw and very real. They've not been shaped or characterized or academicized. And especially in that essay, I found it very moving. You know, it wasn't just a travelogue. It was a experience of a woman through your own life experience. And I think that that's the way most of these essays are. Like, and the collection is, they bleed into each other. You talk about your son, that you raised a communist instead of a Jew. And then there's a moment in that essay where you see a tent city, where there's Israelis or, you know, protesting the cost of living and the cost of apartment, and that would make your son happy, you know. So there's, you're the narrative, you're the subject, indirectly or directly.
I would just say a couple of things. So first of all, I raised my son to be a Jew, but he turned out a communist. And he says his way of being a Jew is being, well, he's a socialist. So it's not that he's not, you know. But the other thing is, I think it only seems like it's not censored. So anybody who's writing, of course, is leaving some things out, you know. I'm honest to a point. You don't know what I censored. But why do it if you're not going to be honest? When I was writing my book on Catherine Weldon, I kept saying maybe, and I don't know, and who knows, and we imagine. And Charlie Baxter, who was my friend and colleague then, read an early draft, and he said, Eileen, nobody's going to pay $25 for a book of maybe, I imagine, it seems. You know, you gotta go out on a limb, or, you know, it's like the Olympics are coming up. If somebody just does, you know, one spin, I can do one spin on ice. You know, you got to do 6 spins, 8 spins, you know, while you're tumbling over head over heels. So it only seems that way. The other thing I'd say is the difference between a travelogue and an essay about a trip you took is the travelogue is just about what you saw and what you did. An essay about a trip or about anything is you're trying to answer a question, and the only way you can answer that question is to go on the trip. So my question is, what do I really think about Israel? You know, I've had so many different, you know, from when I was a little kid and wanted to go, you know, I was singing, playing Exodus on the piano, and I wanted to go fight, you know, for the liberation of my people, to being on a campus where you can't say the word Israel, but you get jumped on. I didn't know what to think. So you have to go. And Marion really loves everything. You know, he's Polish Catholic, but he loves everything about Jews and Israel. And I couldn't.
Marion was your partner for about 10 years.
So yeah, so it's going on the trip to answer a question, and the research that you do is both experiential, and anything you don't know, you have to ask somebody or look it up or try to find out.
That was a long essay. Did you intend it to be a book, or did you intend it to be a shorter essay? Did it evolve over time?
I intend everything to be a shorter essay. I can't write my name in fewer than 10 pages. I had no idea it'd be that long, but it just kept going and going. And then I thought, well, nobody's going to publish anything this long. I'll just save it if I ever have a book. And to admit, I was scared to publish it. But then Plowshares, which has always been so important. I see DeWitt Henry is here. And Plowshares really gave me my start. A wonderful literary magazine. And they have something called Plowshare Solos, which are long essays, long form journalism. They publish the piece alone and then in an anthology. And so, you know, Plowshares came to the rescue and published that as a solo, for which I was very grateful.
We're coming towards the end. I wanted to talk about the essay that created the title of the book, Maybe It's Me, which you started out as a stand-up routine about what it's like to date online in your 60s. And I thought that we could talk about that before we open it up to the audience. If you want to read a little bit from it.
Sure.
About
So,
your varied experience of dating online.
It was terrible. Yeah, so as I said, I grew up at the Catskills. I was always really interested in stand-up comedy. And when a little bit in Ann Arbor, and then when I moved to New York, I did some stand-up, and it was a lot of fun. It was just great. And so I had this idea I would try to do a one-woman show about dating in your 60s in New York. And then the pandemic hit. So I thought, well, it would have been really hard to figure out how to do this in the theater and get it produced. It's not something I have experience with. So I would do it as a written stand-up act. So it's titled, Maybe It's Me, the one-woman show I'll never perform in public. It also felt very scary to me. I mean, I always said, like now, of course, now no one's gonna ever want to date me because I'm telling the truth about what it's like. So I should say it's comic, it's exaggerated, but everything in this essay is true. I'm really happy. Okay. I turned 60, I moved to New York. People said, why would you move to New York? The streets there are smeared with dog shit, with people shit. It's so hot in the subway, your blood bubbles in your veins. The train you want is never coming. For the price of a bedbug infested shoebox in Manhattan, you could afford an entire house in the nicest neighborhood in Ann Arbor, Michigan, which is exactly what I traded for my lousy shoebox in Manhattan. I told everyone, I love the theater. I love ballet, opera, great restaurants, world-class museums. The truth is, I wanted to find true love before I died. I have to say that line used to be, I wanted to get laid again before I died. But my editor, Joel Shan, said, oh, come on, Eileen, you're better than that. Yeah, okay. I wanted to try find true love before I died. You think just because a woman is in her 60s, she loses her interest in sex? You think desire is like a battery? It runs down. A good-looking man walks by and you don't feel that flutter in your vagina? When you're young and no one has ever done a really good job of making you feel so beautiful, even your tiniest toe is worthy of being sucked on, then sure, you're dying for a man to take you in his arms and kiss you. If you have only ever seen people eating chocolate on TV, you wonder what chocolate tastes like. But after 40 years enjoying everything from Reese's peanut butter cups to the finest, darkest Scharfenberger truffles, are you going to say, nah, I don't care if I ever taste chocolate again? Not so much as an M&M. When you're a kid, you assume women in their 60s should be content to sit around playing mahjong or canasta or whatever games old ladies play. Just shut up and go play canasta. Put on your tracksuit and your old lady shoes and go for a walk around the mall with your other old lady friends. If a woman in her 60s is looking for a man, that might be cute. But if she complains no one wants to date her, hey, you ought to be glad you're not tied to a wheelchair and drooling on your pajamas. When you're young, you don't understand that old people feel exactly the same as you. It's still me in here. Someone zipped me inside this old lady suit and I can't get out. Maybe you're a little wiser, but all this means is you're less willing to settle for the bullshit you settled for as a kid. I do not need a man to complete me. The last time I looked, I was not missing any parts. Most of the time, I am happier to be alone. It's just if you only get touched when some drunk on the subway presses up against you, you come down with an emotional flu. You know how everybody says healthcare isn't a privilege, it's a right? Well, it ought to be a right to have someone who can hug you once a month. Someone you can compare notes with after you see a movie. Someone you can go shopping with so you don't need to lug home all the bottles and cans and jars. Someone who will make the salad while you make the pasta. And really, shouldn't everyone be guaranteed a special someone who is obliged to drive them home after a colonoscopy? I don't need a man to fertilize my eggs. I am not a science fair project. I already have a son. My biological clock isn't ticking. You know the hourglass and the Wizard of Oz? That's the timepiece we're talking about here. I get to spend however many years I have left on this planet locked in the witch's tower with only Toto to keep me company. And when the sand runs out, the witch flies back with her monkey men and uses her giant axe to lop off my head. Here's what it's like to be in your 60s. You lie in bed wondering if anyone will ever see your breasts again. Touch them, kiss them, appreciate how smooth they still are, how soft. It's like buying a bag of oranges, and you aren't sure you can eat them fast enough before they wither and attract the fruit flies. So I moved to New York, because if you live in a college town in the Midwest, you are going to run through the eligible men very quickly, at least the ones who aren't your students, or your therapists, or your best friend's ex-husbands, who aren't worse than other men, except you already know they never empty the dishwasher and occasionally sleep with prostitutes. Also, I thought men in New York might not find me as intimidating as men in the rest of the country find me. I am only 5'4", I weigh 125 pounds, but when I was young, I made the tragic mistake of earning a degree in physics. And apparently that makes a woman as undateable as the Incredible Hulk. Men are afraid they will be sucking on a nipple and the woman will whisper, the sum of the square of the legs of a right triangle equals the square of the hypotenuse. Also, I have published a lot of books and men worry I will write about how small their penises are or how they aren't good at giving head, which I would never do unless they treated me in such a way as to justify such a comment.
Okay,
Should I?
time. Yeah, we have time. Thank you, Eileen. That's a little taste of this wonderful, wonderful book. I just wanted to give us some time to talk about some of the questions that people have posed. The first one is from Catherine Vaz, and she said you mentioned a new novel in the works. Can you say anything above it? And in caps, I love the essays.
Thank you, dear Catherine. Well, it goes back. I'm always going back to that town that I couldn't wait to escape from. It takes place in the summer of 1974, the year I graduated high school. A lot of it's sort of autofiction. A lot of it's based on stuff that happened to me, stuff that was going on in the town around me. And again, it's sort of about how, I think a lot of us are reevaluating what we thought we knew about our experience. So I sort of was involved with one of my teachers, with a boss at the insurance company where I worked. And a lot of what was going on as I said, blinded me to what was going on with other people, which was much worse than what was happening with me. So it's sort of a Me Too revisioning of what I thought I knew about my own experience, but it's not focused entirely on that. It's also looking at what I didn't see because I was so obsessed with my own, sort of, oh, poor me. I think we're all so obsessed with sex, from junior high through college, that it warps, we make some really bad decisions. It really influences the rest of our lives, but it also blinds us to what else is going on that's not just about sex. And I see my good friend Maxine Rodberg is here. She's the only person who's read a draft of this. And a lot of what I just said is she's smiling because it's what the next draft is going to be like, as opposed to the first draft, which was focused a bit too much on my own troubles.
DeWitt Henry says, essay or fiction, I'd love to hear your opinion or affinity with Grace Paley's Little Disturbances of Man, especially the loudest voice.
Yes. Well, Grace Paley is the mother of us all. She's certainly my fictional mother. I became a fiction writer because, as I said, I couldn't get into the fiction classes at Yale. You had to be an English major, a writer, you had to be on the Yale Daily News, whatever. So I started with nonfiction, so I took John Hersey's nonfiction class, but then he let me take his fiction class. And I had never read any good fiction. I just read bad stuff. None of it spoke to me, and none of it seemed like something I ever could write. If you grew up in the Catskills, Jewish, living a crazy life, I just didn't hear a voice that sounded like my own. Nobody was writing about anything I knew anything about. And Hersey was just amazing. One of the first stories he gave the whole class to read was Grace Paley's Goodbye and Good Luck. And the minute I heard her voice, I just thought, oh my God, that's the voice I grew up hearing. That's my voice. She's writing about things I know. And I read everything Grace had written by then. And I was lucky enough in my life to get to spend some quality time with her, hear her read. She loved my son, Noah. And, I just have so channeled her, not only in terms of the voice and what she wrote about, but trying to channel her social consciousness. And of course, I don't march the way she marched, and I was not nearly as devoted as she was, but I often ask myself, what would Grace do? And then I try to do it. And yeah, the loudest voice, that wasn't the first story I read, but clearly if you grow up being told you're obnoxious, and then you read the loudest voice, I have to say, so the first time I ever heard Grace read was in Harvard Square, and she got up in front of the room, and she looked like all my, everybody I knew from the Catskills, and she took an entire pack of juicy fruit gum, and piece by piece, she put every piece in her mouth before she started reading. She's going, well, I wasn't so, when she starts reading. And so, yeah, you can hear a little bit of, and I don't do that in, I have a serious mode when I write serious fiction, serious essays, and then I have this more comic mode, and the comic mode is definitely channeling Grace Paley and Cynthia Ozick to some extent, some other writers, Philip Roth, Leonard Michaels.
Christina Stern says, when you write, do you have an image in mind of a particular type of reader or audience? And by the way, your description of yourself in relation to Israeli magazines and models brought tears to my eyes. It was very powerful.
Do I have an audience? Kind of the folks I'm looking at right now on the screen, you're my ideal readers, my friends, but I think when I first started out as a writer, I didn't really trust other people so much. I think I wrote too much for like my teachers, for older men. They were the judges. And in fact, that's one thing that this novel I'm writing now is about, how I grew up thinking, these older men knew everything. They were the judges, the gods, and they really were there were a lot of problems with being a girl growing up, thinking that the older men are the judges and the people you want to please, and not trusting other girls, other women, because I was bullied a lot, you know, when I was junior high and high school. So I didn't come to trust and love other women, male friends, until I was older. And so I think it was a gradual process of learning to write for not my family, not the older male teachers and bosses and everybody, but my friends, my beloved female friends, and I have a lot of really good male friends too. So I think that's my audience.
I think we're right about ready to close. I wanted to thank you so much again for letting us host your launch. To those who didn't know, Maybe It's Me was one of the 50 books most anticipated in 2022 by Lit Hub, and I hope you have a great run with it. You can buy it from us or come to our stores. You can hit the link below. We're happy to send it to you. I'm sure Eileen would love to hear your response, and I wish you the best of luck.
Thanks, Cheryl. Thanks for all you've done for us and for so many other writers. Really, you're the angel of McNally Jackson. So
Thank you so much. All right, everybody, good night. Stay warm.
Thanks,
Avoid
everybody,
the
for coming.
snowstorm. Stay healthy.
Bye-bye.
Good night.